Well, basically, Your Honor, I did have sex with all three men within a 2-week period of time.
You're not sure which of 3 men fathered your 2-year-old daughter, grew up without a father, and don't want the same for your little girl. Hey, Ms. Alston cheated with another man, and you have proof. Potential father number 2, and he's waiting in our courtroom. He's the only father figure in the child's life.
But out of the 3 men, I did have a relationship with the 2, Joe Jr. and Mr. Jones right here. A few months after we got into the relationship, I did cheat, and I told him of it.
Yes, she did cheat on me, and she told me about it. Yeah, we kind of worked on it, but I never really got over it. How would you feel if you're not the dad?
I told you after the test that you may not be the father.
When you gave birth, who was at the hospital?
His mom came. Originally, it was just my mom and my brother. Miss Childs was here, and I saw that Mr. Jones was here.
The courtroom of Judge Lauren Lake opens with an atmosphere built on uncertainty, emotional fatigue, and the overwhelming weight of unresolved relationships. Several people arrive carrying different versions of the same story, and each believes their version is justified. They step into the courtroom seeking answers, but it becomes clear that the answers they want and the answers the law provides do not always match. The session revolves around questions of paternity, responsibility, past choices, and the deeper struggle between personal truth and legal truth. Judge Lauren Lake presides as a stabilizing presence, guiding the parties with a mixture of firmness, empathy, and an investigative urgency that reflects the relationship between law and justice. She handles the matter with the precision of someone who knows that real families, not hypothetical legal theories, stand in front of her, and each decision echoes far beyond the courtroom. The first dispute centers on a young mother, Ms. Alston, a woman describing 2 years of confusion about her daughter Jasmine's biological father. 3 possible fathers are present or represented: Mr. Jones, Mr. Delk, and the father represented by his own father, Mr. Joe Harrison S.R. Since his son is not present, Judge Lake must analyze the overlapping timelines, admissions, emotional tensions, and emerging inconsistencies. The file's testimony shows that Ms. Alston openly admits intimacy with all 3 men within a short period, which leads to legal ambiguity about biological paternity. This is the point where the evidence stage in a divorce case, the adverse inference in the Evidence Act, and the broader concept of justice in jurisprudence subtly appear. This is not a divorce case, but the courtroom's tension resembles the types of emotional stakes that often surface during custodial or financial disputes. The weight of hidden information, conflicting declarations, and long-standing resentment creates the kind of environment legal scholars discuss when examining truth, proof, and the fairness of the adversarial system. Even though no one says it directly, the dynamic demonstrates how truth changes everything, especially when people regret earlier decisions and must face evidence that reveals what emotions once concealed. Judge Lauren Lake listens as Ms. Alston describes her situation. She acknowledges relationships with 2 of the men and a one-night encounter with the 3rd. This acknowledgement becomes the basis for legal examination. The courtroom fills with more layers of complication once the grandparents arrive. Grandparents on both sides express love for Jasmine and speak about their emotional bonds, routines, and contributions to the child's upbringing. These details contribute to the broader idea that families form through more than biology. Yet biology still matters for legal determinations of child support, responsibilities, and parental recognition, issues that frequently lead to appellate arguments and in some cases reach the Supreme Court. The appearance of grandparents also introduces themes similar to adoption stories' full episodes, where biological relationships may not always define who genuinely shows up for a child. The testimonies resemble celebrate recovery testimonies, where people reflect on past mistakes, confront uncomfortable truths, and attempt to repair the damage caused by earlier decisions. Everyone in this courtroom has something they regret, whether it's failing to commit, failing to disclose, or failing to set boundaries before emotions turned into long-term responsibilities. Mr. Jones arrives denying paternity because he believes Ms. Alston cheated. He claims to have proof, suggesting a personal investigation outside the courtroom. His presence introduces another layer of emotional injury, something commonly heard in DNA test cheating stories, where people describe betrayal that reshapes their lives. Everything he says and the way he reacts illustrates how unresolved emotional wounds can present as legal objections once parties step into a courtroom. Next, Mr. Delk enters the case with a mixture of confidence and humility. He is significantly older than the other men and initially believed that biology made paternity unlikely. Despite this belief, he still stepped into the role of caregiver and provider. This leads the courtroom into a discussion highlighting how emotional responsibility sometimes outweighs biological certainty. His testimony describes months of feeding, caring for, housing, and emotionally supporting the child. The people listening, Judge Lake included, recognize this as something deeper than temporary assistance. It resembles the kind of dedication discussed in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal professionals analyze how people step into roles they never expected but end up redefining responsibility. Judge Lake observes that each party claims to be acting out of concern for Jasmine, yet each also carries a different motivation rooted in fear, pride, guilt, or love. The courtroom becomes a mirror of conflicting intentions. The mother desires financial stability, emotional consistency, and clarity. One man wants closure, another wants acknowledgement for stepping up, and the third, through his father, wants his side of the family recognized. The grandparents worry about the child's identity and emotional well-being. Through her questioning, Judge Lake pushes Ms. Alston to confront her own motivations. She challenges her repeated statement of wanting the father to step up, pointing out that several people already have stepped up while the mother sometimes hesitated in moments requiring accountability. This exchange highlights the practical tension between legal rights and moral responsibilities. It echoes episodes of the Divorce Course podcast, where legal professionals discuss how people often misunderstand what the law will interpret as responsibility versus what society interprets as responsibility. Judge Lauren Lake's job is not simply to identify the biological father. She must also remind everyone that the child's emotional development remains paramount. She emphasizes that financial help, while important, is not the only measure of parental commitment. She guides the mother to acknowledge her role in creating the confusion and the urgency of putting the child's needs first. The case intensifies when additional testimony reveals inconsistencies about who was informed, who was present at the birth, and how many men were aware they could potentially be the father. Disagreements arise not only among the men, but also between the mother and the grandparents. These disagreements show how fragile trust becomes when a DNA test becomes central. Many of the individuals describe experiences that match broader societal conversations explored in Truth Changes Everything podcast episodes, where DNA tests disrupt established relationships and force families to redefine themselves. As the testimonies unfold, Judge Lake consistently returns to the need for clarity. She emphasizes that DNA results do not just determine biology, they determine legal responsibilities, emotional expectations, and social narratives. The courtroom atmosphere resembles educational discussions in evidence law, where the role of DNA as scientific proof is compared with traditional forms of testimony. Legal students often examine such cases to understand how the justice system balances personal stories with scientific certainty. By the time Judge Lake reaches the moment of announcing the results, the courtroom is emotionally charged. She delivers the results one step at a time. First, she reveals that the grandfather, Mr. Harrison S.R., is not the biological grandfather. This result removes one possible father instantly and dramatically shifts family expectations. The courtroom reacts with shock, disappointment, and yet a strange sense of relief as one layer of uncertainty finally dissolves. Judge Lake then moves to the crucial envelope naming the biological father. At this moment, everything in the courtroom becomes silent. The entire room acknowledges that the months of doubt, the disagreements, and the emotional strain will finally meet the one force that cannot lie: DNA. The results show that the biological father is Mr. Delk. His emotional reaction softens the tension. He embraces the reality, and others, even those disappointed, accept the truth. The grandparents express that regardless of biology, Jasmine remains part of their emotional family. Judge Lake acknowledges the blended family that emerged from this painful process, emphasizing that love, stability, and structure must guide the future. After the emotionally heavy conclusion of the first paternity matter, Judge Lauren Lake transitions the courtroom into another dispute, one that carries even more complexity, emotional entanglement, and conceptual challenges surrounding the relationship between law and justice. This second case introduces a completely different set of circumstances, where intimacy, trust, and personal boundaries merge into a legal question that only a DNA test can settle. It becomes an example of how the justice system, through its evidence-based procedures, must confront situations that are deeply unconventional yet require the same objective analysis. The second matter begins with Ms. Strong, her husband Mr. Strong, and a woman named Ms. McLean. Unlike typical paternity disputes, this case is tightly intertwined with personal arrangements, private decisions, and intimate agreements between all three individuals. What distinguishes this case is that the parties openly admit to entering into repeated three-person intimate encounters, which introduces unique layers of responsibility, expectation, and confusion about paternity. It is a dynamic rarely seen in courtrooms but increasingly discussed in modern social commentary and in episodes of various relationship-focused podcasts, such as the Divorce Course podcast, where unconventional relationship arrangements collide with legal consequences. Judge Lauren Lake listens as Ms. Strong explains that she and her friend, Ms. McLean, originally planned a birthday celebration that turned into an agreement to involve Mr. Strong in a consensual three-person relationship. The foundation of their testimony shows a deliberate choice made under the assumption that pregnancy was unlikely due to medical issues previously described by Ms. McLean. This assumption becomes the root of the entire conflict. Ms. Strong explains that they set guidelines before entering the arrangement. The encounters would always involve all three individuals together, never separately, and if a pregnancy did occur, the child would be raised collectively. These guidelines show an attempt to create boundaries, which mirrors discussions often heard in legal podcasts like the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where lawyers discuss how personal agreements, especially verbal ones, can crumble when tested by real-life consequences. Mr. Strong reinforces this narrative, sharing that he initially felt hesitant due to past decisions and concerns about potential emotional manipulation. His hesitation reveals deeper insecurities about trust. Yet despite those concerns, he eventually participated, believing the arrangement was safe from long-term consequences. This assumption later becomes part of the emotional dispute, as he expresses that had there been any expectation of pregnancy, more precautions would have been taken. Judge Lake presses into this inconsistency because assumptions, unspoken doubts, and verbal agreements often dissolve in court when tested against the more rigid framework of procedural truth and the structured logic of jurisprudence. As testimony continues, it becomes evident that Ms. McLean was also in a separate relationship during this period, which further complicates the issue of biological paternity. She explains that her primary assumption at the time of conception was that her boyfriend was the father. This assumption was based on the frequency of their intimacy and the belief that a few isolated encounters with the Strongs held a lesser probability of conception. This logic, while understandable emotionally, does not align with biological reality, and Judge Lake firmly reminds her of this. The courtroom sees how assumptions, rather than clarity, shape people's decisions, something that often surfaces in the evidence stage in a divorce case when parties must confront uncomfortable truths they avoided earlier. The legal complexity expands as the court learns that Ms. McLean had her boyfriend tested when the child was an infant, and he was determined not to be the father. Despite this definitive result, she did not immediately inform the Strongs or pursue clarity through a court-authorized test. Judge Lake recognizes this delay as a significant lapse in responsibility, because months passed while the identity of the father remained uncertain. This delay mirrors the concept of adverse inference in evidence law, where failing to take timely action or withholding relevant information creates suspicion about one's motives. Even though Ms. McLean insists she did not intend to hide anything, the timeline forces the court to consider how her decisions impacted every person involved. At this point in the description, the courtroom shifts from testimony about events to testimony about behaviors. The Strongs reveal that they later encountered the child on the street by chance and immediately questioned whether she might be Mr. Strong's biological daughter. The appearance, mannerisms, and subtle similarities sparked suspicion and emotional investment. Ms. Strong even describes calculating the conception date and realizing that the timeline aligned with a night when Ms. McLean had not left their shared space, increasing the possibility of paternity. This reveals a compelling theme. People often conduct their own informal investigations long before stepping into a courtroom. These informal investigations sometimes reflect the types of personal stories shared in DNA test people regret taking discussions online, where individuals recount how a DNA test brought certainty, but also emotional upheaval. Judge Lake's approach remains focused and calm. She emphasizes that paternity cannot be resolved by comparing appearances or personal memories. Only a DNA test can settle the matter definitively, reinforcing the idea that truth, especially scientific truth, overrides even the most heartfelt assumptions. This principle reflects the broader message of the Truth Changes Everything podcast, which frequently explores how DNA testing transforms relationships across families, often in unexpected ways. The Strongs explain that once they became involved, they immediately embraced the child emotionally. They purchased baby supplies, furniture, accessories, clothing, and ensured the child had a safe space in their home. They describe a budding relationship between the child and their existing children, who quickly welcomed the baby as a possible sibling. These descriptions reinforce the emotional reality underpinning the case. People can form genuine parental bonds without biological confirmation. This resonates with themes seen in adoption stories' full episodes, where emotional attachment and caregiving often define family more strongly than genetics. Ms. Strong shares a deeply personal revelation. She underwent a medical procedure related to cancer and now cannot have biological children. This adds a critical emotional dimension to the case. For her, The possibility that this child could be her husband's biological daughter carries symbolic weight. It becomes an opportunity for him to have a biological child despite her own medical limitations. Judge Lake handles this revelation with empathy, acknowledging that these personal circumstances make the results even more emotionally significant. This is one of the moments where the courtroom's emotional weight intersects with the philosophical concept of justice in jurisprudence, reminding everyone that the law often operates inside human stories that cannot be reduced to simple facts. When Judge Lake asks about the future, specifically what would happen if the child is confirmed as Mr. Strong's, the Strongs respond with openness. Ms. Strong says she would accept the child wholeheartedly, acknowledging that the child would be a gift in their lives. She emphasizes that her husband treats her own children like they are his biological offspring, making it natural to offer the same love to any child biologically connected to him. This sentiment reflects the deeper themes of Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where individuals look beyond past mistakes to embrace redemption, growth, and emotional responsibility. The testimonies also show that the three individuals continued their intimate relationship even after the pregnancy, including up until just weeks before the court appearance. This introduces questions about boundaries, ongoing emotional entanglement, and the complications of trying to separate intimacy from parental responsibility. Judge Lake expresses concern about this dynamic, encouraging them to consider how these choices might affect their stability moving forward. Her guidance mirrors discussions from legal academics who explore the relationship between law and justice, and how much the courtroom can or cannot regulate interpersonal agreements. When Judge Lake determines that all testimony has been clarified, she moves toward the DNA results. The courtroom becomes still, and everyone prepares for the one moment that determines the next chapter of their lives. The mother expresses hope that Mr. Strong is the biological father, believing this would give her daughter a chance to grow up with a father present in her life. She also insists she will not cut Mr. Strong out of the child's life, even if the results are negative. She claims there are no additional possible fathers beyond those already discussed, asserting that there will be no surprises. Judge Lake, drawing from years of courtroom experience, remarks that people often make such promises, but DNA always speaks louder. With the envelopes in hand, Judge Lake prepares to reveal the truth. In the first case, she reminded the courtroom that a child's emotional foundation depends not only on biology, but on consistent support, accountability, and love. In this second case, she reinforces that legal clarity is essential to prevent future emotional confusion. The decision will affect not only parental responsibilities and support obligations, but also the child's long-term identity. Finally, Judge Lake reads the result. Mr. Strong is not the biological father. The courtroom absorbs this information with a mix of shock, disappointment, and resignation. The Strongs, who had emotionally prepared for the possibility of welcoming the child as part of their family, must now accept that the DNA test removes that role from their legal and biological future. Judge Lake delivers the news with sympathy, aware of how deeply this affects their hopes and emotional investment. Ms. McLean reacts with visible emotional distress. She admits that she did not know her boyfriend conducted the previous DNA test independently, and that she trusted his verbal claim that the child was not his. Judge Lake points out that relying on verbal claims without official documentation is a serious mistake, especially in matters that profoundly affect a child's life. She urges Ms. McLean to take responsibility and continue searching for the biological father, so the child can eventually understand her own identity. As the results settle in the courtroom and the weight of truth becomes impossible to avoid, Judge Lauren Lake shifts the tone from legal resolution to guidance. What follows is less about who fathered the children and more about what these outcomes mean for the emotional, legal, and relational future of everyone involved. The courtroom no longer feels like a battleground for competing stories. Instead, it becomes a reflective space where accountability, next steps, and the role of evidence become central to the discussion. In the aftermath of the second paternity ruling, Judge Lake ensures that each party understands the deeper implications of the result. For Ms. McLean, the revelation that Mr. Strong is not the biological father marks the collapse of another assumption. She acknowledges that she had believed her ex-partner's informal DNA results without demanding official documentation. Judge Lake highlights this as a critical misstep. Relying on unverified claims in matters of paternity can misguide a child's future and create needless emotional turmoil. This reminder aligns with the principle emphasized in discussions of evidence law, where verifiable proof carries the highest weight and assumptions, regardless of sincerity, are insufficient. Judge Lake also stresses that the child involved deserves clarity regarding her biological identity. In legal theory, especially under the concept of justice in jurisprudence, a child's right to identity is a foundational element. The law recognizes that children have an inherent need to understand their origins, and courts emphasize truth as an essential part of that right. This resonates strongly with themes often discussed in Truth Changes Everything podcast episodes, where guests explain how knowing the truth, especially through DNA, reconstructs a person's emotional landscape. As the courtroom processes the result, Ms. Strong and Mr. Strong confront their own set of emotional consequences. They had prepared themselves for the possibility of embracing the child as part of their family, especially given their medical challenges and the lack of biological children in their future together. Their willingness to welcome the child highlights the difference between biological parenthood and emotional parenthood. This difference is frequently examined in adoption stories' full episodes, where individuals learn that love and commitment sometimes matter more than genetics. Still, the DNA result establishes legal boundaries that emotion alone cannot cross. Judge Lake expresses admiration for the compassion the Strongs demonstrated, even in a circumstance fueled by unconventional relationship choices. However, she reminds all three parties that their repeated intimate engagement complicated the matter. She advises them to reassess their boundaries and consider the emotional consequences before continuing such arrangements. Her tone is not judgmental but practical, consistent with her commitment to balancing judicial authority with human understanding. This guidance reflects what legal professionals discuss in programs like the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where attorneys analyze how personal decisions can create legal challenges that the justice system eventually must untangle. The judge also highlights the importance of responsibility when engaging in consensual but complicated relationship structures. Decisions involving intimacy, trust, and shared experiences should be handled with maturity, foresight, and an understanding of potential outcomes. When people ignore these responsibilities, they later find themselves in court, asking the legal system to clean up emotional and relational consequences. This mirrors the emotional patterns explored in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where individuals acknowledge past mistakes and seek healthier paths forward. In both the first and second cases, the courtroom lessons converge. Truth, especially scientific truth, forces people to confront realities they avoided, misunderstood, or tried to navigate emotionally. A DNA test becomes the ultimate equalizer in the courtroom. It removes bias, overrides storytelling, and silences arguments. That is why paternity cases often embody the phrase DNA test people regret taking, not because the test is wrong, but because the truth it reveals can be heavier than expected. Judge Lauren Lake uses these moments to reinforce why evidence matters so profoundly in determining family law outcomes. In the modern era, legal systems increasingly rely on scientific methods because they resist manipulation and personal interpretation. This is particularly important in paternity matters, where emotional narratives often conflict with biological fact. The courtroom becomes a stage, not of performance, but of proof. This is where the philosophical foundation of the relationship between law and justice becomes visible. The law demands evidence, but justice involves guiding people through the consequences of that evidence. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Lake reminds the participants that children must always remain the focus. They are the ones who live with the outcomes long after the courtroom session ends. This emphasis aligns with discussions surrounding the Supreme Court's handling of child support and parental obligations across various jurisdictions. High courts repeatedly affirm that a child's right to support, identity, and stability supersedes the adult's interpersonal conflicts. Judge Lake echoes this view, insisting that adults must take responsibility for clarity, consistency, and honesty, even if it challenges their personal comfort. As the session nears its close, the broader themes of justice and responsibility begin to settle in. The first case ended with relief for some and disappointment for others, but ultimately, the child gained legal clarity. The second case, though emotionally heavier for the Strongs, illustrates how DNA results create pathways for truth to emerge, even when the truth complicates relationships. These are the moments often referred to in legal commentary and podcasts, such as the Divorce Course podcast, where hosts dissect how intimate relationships intersect with the demands of the legal system. The atmosphere in the courtroom reflects the emotional arc of both cases: anticipation, confrontation, revelation, and acceptance. Each participant must now move forward with the information DNA has provided. Judge Lake emphasizes that the final step, beyond accepting the truth, is acting responsibly upon it. For Ms. Alston in the first case, the next step is cooperating with the biological father and both sets of grandparents to support Jasmine's upbringing. Judge Lake encourages her to maintain transparency, ensure paternity responsibilities are handled properly, and prioritize Jasmine's emotional well-being. Even though she expressed financial strain, the judge stresses that parenting is not merely economic. It requires emotional commitment, honesty, and stability. The legal system can enforce child support, but only the adults involved can provide consistent love and guidance. For Mr. Delk, identified as the father, the result brings both relief and responsibility. His previous dedication to caring for the child now becomes reinforced by biological confirmation. Judge Lake recognizes this as a positive outcome, reminding him that his emotional involvement will now merge with legal obligations, creating consistency for Jasmine. For the grandparents in the first case, the results challenge their expectations but also expand their roles. Judge Lake acknowledges their open hearts and willingness to love the child, highlighting that familial bonds often grow beyond biological ties. These bonds resemble the extended family structures often highlighted in adoption or kinship-based stories, where love becomes the foundation rather than genetics. In the second case, Judge Lake addresses Ms. McLean gently but firmly. She must now identify the correct biological father so her daughter does not grow up without clarity. The judge instructs her not to rely on informal claims again and to pursue official, documented testing immediately. This directive reinforces the principle that truth cannot be built on assumptions. It must be built on verifiable evidence. Judge Lake also turns toward the Strongs with respect. She acknowledges their disappointment, but commends their willingness to support the child emotionally before knowing the truth. She encourages them to view this experience not as a loss, but as a testament to their compassion, reminding them that parenthood can take many forms. Their reaction reflects the kind of emotional maturity that helps families navigate difficult truths. The judge concludes by reinforcing the importance of seeking truth, respecting boundaries, and prioritizing children. She reminds all participants that while the courtroom offers answers, it is their responsibility to transform those answers into healthier futures. The justice system can determine paternity, order support, and confirm rights, but it cannot fix fractured trust, re-establish boundaries, or rebuild emotional stability. Those tasks belong to the people involved. In the final minutes, the courtroom becomes quiet again, not with tension but with understanding. Judge Lake's closing words resonate with the essence of both cases. Truth changes everything. Whether through a DNA test, testimony, or legal analysis, truth reshapes relationships and forces personal growth. Her role, as always, balances the firm logic of the law with the compassionate guidance needed to help people face difficult realities. Through these two complex cases, the courtroom illustrates how law and emotion intersect. It shows why the justice system relies on scientific certainty, how families navigate confusion, and how individuals must confront their decisions. The cases reflect broader societal conversations found across podcasts, legal commentary, and real-life experiences. The pursuit of truth, the consequences of choices, and the necessity of accountability. As everyone prepares to leave the courtroom, one final lesson remains, one that echoes across jurisdictions and family law systems worldwide. Evidence brings clarity, but accountability brings justice. And under the steady guidance of Judge Lauren Lake, both truths become possible.